Donald Trump may be the first president in history to vanquish his opposition by driving it mad. The Democrats' situation has been deteriorating since Clinton's surprise defeat. Now we appear to be witnessing a contest to determine which lunatic will be put in charge of running the asylum. The turmoil is painful to watch. It almost makes one wish for a return to the days of Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, and smoke filled back rooms when we were spared the torment. The Democratic Party is suffering from two afflictions at once: Trump derangement syndrome, or TDS, and the socialism championed by Bernie Sanders and ratcheted up by media darling Alexandra Ocasio Cortez and her fellow squadettes. TDS has migrated through the Democratic hierarchy like rabies, overriding their normal instincts and behavior. They circle around aimlessly, snarling and foaming at the mouth, with apparently not a thought about doing the nation's business in behalf of their constituents. They want to get their teeth into the president and somehow undo the 2016 election. But derangement has so damaged the party's central nervous system that it has deprived it of the necessary motor control. They can't get near the Trumpster, but only circle and growl. Meanwhile, the socialists have created a schism that has the Democratic poobahs totally flummoxed. I remind viewers that I'm a recovering Democrat who sympathizes with the plight of the workaday faithful. I was once one of them. You've been left out of the equation by your loony leadership. My cynicism, if it can't be helped, is at least tempered by commiseration for those still being shafted by the very people they elected to look after their interests. With Nancy Pelosi and her shock troops working day and night to bring down the president, where are the congressional Dems going to find time to rein in the socialist brats who are undermining the party, let alone legislate the agenda they ran on? To make matters worse, the Trumpster continues to tamper with their medications and goad them into ever more outlandish antics and rhetoric. It's pathetic. But there is hope, despite the craziness. If not in 2020, perhaps in 2040 or 2050. That speculation has precedent. The Democrats were in a similar pickle in 1860. With some difficulty, they survived it, although not before touching off a civil war. Let's take a stroll down memory lane to recall what happened. Today, the internal rift is over socialism. But in 1860, it was slavery. You got to hand it to the Dems. They have a knack for picking defining issues. Northern Democrats were opposed to allowing slavery in the Western territories. Southern Democrats were insistent that folks settling in the West be allowed to cart their slaves along with them. It was proving difficult to nominate a candidate who could please both the North and the South to unify the party. Is this beginning to sound familiar? At the nominating convention in April 1860 in Charleston, South Carolina, Stephen Douglas was put forward. He was their Joe Biden, a man who supposedly could placate the Southern slaveholders, as today's Dems thought Biden could placate the radical leftists. But no soap. The modern radical left thinks the now floundering Mr. Biden is merely a wuss. But the Southern Democrats in 1860 openly loathed Douglas as soft on their core issue. The Southerners walked out of the convention in a snit, denying Douglas the necessary two-thirds vote needed for his nomination. Mind you, this occurred without the added complication of Lincoln derangement syndrome. So you see how much worse things are for the Dems today. 2 months later, in June of 1860, they had another crack at it, holding a second convention in Baltimore. Initially, things went no better for Douglas. The Southerners walked out again, but this time left enough delegates behind to put him over the top. The Bolters, as Douglas called them, now more determined than ever, organized a third convention of their own away from their namby-pamby colleagues. They nominated the pro-slavery John Breckinridge, who was serving as vice president under James Buchanan. The result was a race involving 4 candidates representing 3 parties. The divided Democrats sent Douglas against Abraham Lincoln in the North, and Breckinridge against the Constitutional Unionist Party candidate John Bell in the South. The Constitutional Unionists hoped to snooker Lincoln by denying him the Electoral College votes needed to win, but the strategy flopped. The newly formed Republican Party to which Lincoln belonged won its first presidential victory, with Lincoln receiving 180 electoral votes versus the Dems' 72 and the Unionists' 39. For some while, as we've watched the congressional Democrats writhing like a nest of snakes in hatred and ideological confusion, there has been talk of a sequel in 2020 similar to that of the 1860 election, when President Trump wins re-election, namely a civil war. That seems unlikely in my opinion, if for no other reason than the divide this time around is solely ideological, not geographical. How would we set the battle lines? Besides, the most mainstream Democrats, especially those with money in the bank, regard radicals like Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Bernie's big-mouthed acolytes in the squad as more of a sideshow than harbingers of a new socialist America. The economy under President Trump hasn't harmed them either, even if they cringe at his braggadocio and mocking of their cherished TV talking heads. A more interesting and maybe even more likely possibility is the breakup of the Democratic Party. There is precedent for that too. The Whig Party, which came into being in the 1830s in opposition to Andrew Jackson, the first modern Democratic president, began a lengthy decline in the lead up to the 1860 election. In disillusionment, Lincoln left the Whigs to become a Republican. As with the Democrats, the Whigs experienced intense intra-party division over slavery. Meanwhile, the newly formed American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings, nominated Millard Fillmore, a former Whig and our 13th president, as their candidate in 1856. He lost to Democrat James Buchanan. By the end of the Civil War, the Whig Party and the Know-Nothings were an historical footnote. After the 1860 election, it was 20 years before we elected another Democrat, Grover Cleveland. If today's party doesn't go the way of the 19th century Whigs, 20 years may be little enough for it to find its bearings and offer us another candidate like him. In the era of Republican dominance from the Civil War to 1933, Cleveland was admired for his stance against corruption and his dedication to classical liberalism, that is, liberalism based on civil liberties, economic freedom, and the rule of law. Imagine it. We elected him twice. Memo to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. There are better ways to win the presidency and serve the American people than impeaching your incumbent opponent. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click like and subscribe to support the channel and pass the link along. We'll see you back here next time.